The story of this country is incredibly hidden.
Canadians of generations have been miseducated.
There's this palpable sense of alienation where you were expected to know your place.
But we don't talk about that. We have so many amazing Black histories in Canada.
Canada wasn't this promised land. It was another step in a journey for freedom.
We can't sit around and say that, oh, it's not going to change. You have to address things head on.
We are here. We have been here.
These are all means of Black people organizing their lives against erasure.
These stories are us.
It's beautiful being Black in Canada.
Hi everyone, welcome to this new episode of Carolyn Talks. This is a podcast / YouTube channel where I, your host, Carolyn Hines, film critic and journalist, speak to film creatives around the world about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today is one of my special interviews for the 2023 Toronto International Film Festival. And today my guest is Leslie Norville. She has a docuseries, which I'm actually very excited about. I'm always excited, but you know what? It's a happy thing. But it's about the Black history and Black community in Canada and dealing in different provinces. Like she talks about the culture in Toronto, in Montreal, in Halifax, and the history of Black people, because it is not as happy as a lot of people would like to believe, because guess what? Slavery was existed here in Canada too. And the docuseries gets into that. And I love that you do that, because many people don't know that slavery was actually legal and allowed here in Canada for like hundreds of years before it was abolished. And we'll definitely get into that. And talking about the hip hop scene in Canada, which I will frankly admit I am not that familiar with. So we'll talk about that. But first, as usual, I like to have my guests say a bit about themselves and what inspired them on their path. So first of all, thank you, Leslie, for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I know, I'm excited. For me, your project, I think it's the third project that I've seen related to Black history in Canada in the last couple of years, because one was like the BLK origin story. I really like that docuseries. And then there was one by OM Media. They did like the Canadian Heritage Minutes, where they talked about Chloe. I think her name is Chloe Bailey. No,
Chloe Cooley. Yeah,
Chloe Cooley. I say Chloe Bailey is an actress and a singer. It's Chloe Cooley.
Yes.
So I was happy to see that your project was being shown at TIFF. So tell me how you became involved with this project and what made you decide, you know what, this is the time to create a story about Black Canadian heritage and Black Canadian history.
Yeah, so I've been working as a film producer for many years, and mostly working on projects based in the United States. And I think, there was always an interest and a desire to do something around my experience as a Black Canadian. And so in 2019, me and my producing partner, Miranda de Ponce, went to CBC and pitched the idea of doing a Black history doc series. And we just had an idea at that point, and CBC was immediately on board and gave us some support and told us to go out and do some research. Once we started that, we realized, oh my gosh, there's so much history and so many stories and so many experiences that we knew we were definitely on the right path. And so we got to work creating a pitch for CBC, and they eventually picked it up, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, and I think 2019 seems to be a pivotal moment for, I think, a lot of people with regards to highlighting Black Canadian history, and because, as I said, I mentioned Oya and the BLK project, and they came about I think they began working around the same time. It's like almost as like, I think for a lot of Black Canadians, especially from my observation, I'm an immigrant. I'm from the Caribbean, so I've only been here since 2009, and I worked in the public school sector. You know, I worked at a public school here, and the thing with the way how Black history is treated in the Canadian public school is very sanitary. You know, very whitewashed. You know, they'll be like, these are our Canadian, geniuses, you know, like talking about the creation of like the Porters and the Union, that kind of stuff. But I'm like, where's the mention of slavery existing here? You know, where's the mention of the fact that, yes, that, and you mentioned it in the first episode of the docuseries where it talks about the Underground Railroad, where Canadians are also proud that the Underground Railroad terminated within Canada. You know, that's where they went to freedom, the Great White North, the freedom. But then like they kind of always like ended there. You know, they never discussed the fact that yes, while even when Black people did make it past the outside of the Underground Railroad and they were like, we're free, like they still faced discrimination. You know, there was still the threat of possibly being recaptured and being sold into slavery, whether across the river or, you know, or to a Canadian plantation owner or slave owner. And I love that you start the docuseries there, because like that's where history for Black people begins in Canada, you know, with slavery, which unfortunately is what it has been from the end of the 15th century, when the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish and everyone went to Africa and said, we're going to take these Black people and ship them halfway across the world, you know. So for all of us in the Western Hemisphere, our foundations starts unfortunately with slavery. So you have to begin the series there. So talk about going into that part of Black Canadian history and saying we can't begin the series unless we actually confront this part of Canadian history.
Yeah, so I think talking about slavery in a way that kind of, you know, dispels the myth that we've been told, as you say, and as you said, in our education system was really important. I mean, the whole series is about uncovering untold, undertold, unknown stories about the Black Canadian experience, which there are many, which we weren't able, obviously, to go into all of them in 8 episodes. But telling the story of slavery was really, really important because, as you say, like the underpinnings of who we understand ourselves to be as Canadians is a place that was a safe haven for Black people fleeing and escaping enslavement in the United States. And, you know, if you talk to anybody, and if they outside of Canada and inside of Canada, that history is unknown. And I think in order for us to, you know, start any kind of conversation and dig into these many histories, starting with that kind of myth and dispelling that myth was really, really important for us to do that with this series. Because again, the idea behind this series was to kind of like unearth some of these unknown stories. And, you know, if you talk, as I say, to many Canadians, we don't know our own history. And this is one that really definitely needed to be told.
Yeah, and the reason a lot of us don't know our own history, and not only for people that live within Canada, but outside of Canada, like people have this idea that Canada is a utopia. You know, Canada is better than the U.S. You know, Canada is the more friendly cousin to America in the South. And I'm always very bold and brash and say Canada is not the utopia people think it is. You know, I always say Canada has probably done the best PR campaign of whitewashing and sanitizing their political and the racial history and the racial environment of Canada. You know, like they're like, we welcome immigrants. Yes, okay, but there's actually a lot of barricades and a lot of obstacles for immigrants and even refugees to overcome to even just get in Canada. It's not as easy as a lot of people think. You know, like For instance, like when during the what was happening in the US in 2020 and afterwards, like with George Floyd's murder and the protests and everything, people were like, you know what, I'm gonna leave Canada. I'm gonna leave the US and go to Canada. I'd be like, hold that thought. Let me just tell you a bit of my personal experiences and what I know of Canadian politics and everything. It is not that easy. And people's like, oh wait, I didn't know. I'm like, yeah, because Canada has done a bang up job of saying, you know, we're all so tolerant and welcoming. I'm like, we have a rising far right movement happening right now, you know, like the Nazis and the right wingers, like they're getting bolder with each day, you know, because they see that the politicians aren't saying anything. And that happens in your series. And like in the second episode, it talks a lot about that, about the politics, the political side, the civil rights. There was a civil rights movement in Canada, particularly in Montreal, like you do specifically in Montreal. And I'm like, I didn't even know. I knew in an abstract way there was a civil rights movement, because there's no way all of that would have been happening in the US and even in the Caribbean with like the Black Panther movement. Like they had parties in the Caribbean and in Canada and stuff. But I didn't know it got to the point where there was like actual protests and a sitting at a university. And when I was watching it, I was like, wait, this is literally the first time I've ever heard about this. You know, first time I've ever heard about someone called Rosie Douglas. And I was like, wow, you know, and the reason for that is because I think the difference between Canadian media and the US media is I should say Black people in Canada, and like especially at that time, is they were so, this is just from my opinion, my observation, Black people at that time in Canada were so concerned with fitting in, you know, assimilating. Black people wanted to assimilate, you know, like they were like, we came here to fit in. We want to think. So it's like, keep your head down and don't really talk about it, you know? And then the people who like the Rosie Douglas and those young people who were saying like, no, racism exists here. We need to confront it. We need to fight for our things. They were looked at more as like outsiders, even within the Black community, you know, they were looked at as troublemakers, you know. It was like the whole idea of respectability politics. So talk about from going into research and talking to the people who worked with Rosie. I know I put her name as Brenda
Dash. Yes.
Brenda Dash. Like she was basically, I don't want to compare her, but she was basically the Angela Davis, the Canadian Angela Davis, you know. And I had never heard about her till I watched this documentary. And it was like, this woman was constantly arrested and placed, and because like she was being racially profiled, and like the RCMP, they were watching her, you know, they had them watching her. When we hear about Black people being watched by the government and everything, we think Martin Luther King, we think of like civil rights leaders in the US, but I'm like, no, that was happening here in Canada too.
Yeah, so it definitely was. And I mean, there was a lot of, just to talk to your research question point. So, you know, this series was made by, you know, so many people. So we had story producers and directors who did extensive research into the histories. We collaborated with historical consultants, because while this history is mostly unknown to a large swath of Canadians, there have been people doing this research for decades, going unheralded. So people like David Austin, people like Afua Cooper, people like Ronaldo Walcott are historians, academics who've been doing this research, and there are many, many others that I can list and who appear in the series, who all contributed to unearthing this history. And again, I just want to go back to our story producers and our directors. So our story producers on our episode Revolution Remix were, you know, did such an amazing job of like diving into David Austin's work into this period of time in Montreal history, and really unearthing the stories from elders who were actually there. And so the director, Michelle Stevenson, who is from Quebec, she did, her and her team did a lot of work in really making sure that the stories of the elders, like, as you mentioned, the Brenda Dashes, the Philip Fizames, were captured and they could tell their story. These are people who were actually there during that time, participating in these movements, participating in the Serge George Williams affair, and sitting, protesting alongside many of their fellow students to, advocate for their rights for fair treatment at Sir George Williams University. And, it was really, really important to get that history right. And so doing that extensive historical research and collaborating with some of Canada's top Black scholars was really, really important in allowing for us to tell those stories in a way that honors our elders and also, again, tells an untold story.
Mm. And you mentioned the word honoring the elders, and one of the things that I love that you did in this docuseries is that you don't censor, the racial slurs that were hurled at these Black people throughout the hundreds of years of this history. Because even in the first episode, like there's the Code Noir, which talks about the punishment that enslaved Black people within Canada were given. It gives like, this is how we punish them, this is what happens. And like they talked about the language, and like you use the language and you show it there. And then in the second episode, where you have the people like Brenda Dash and these West Indian I guess you would call them expats, and these Black people who were around at that time, they were like, these are the words that we were called, so this is what we're going to show you. And you were like, it's about honoring their words, this is their experience, we're not going to censor it and sanitize it for people who be like, but you don't have to show, and like you can. I'm like, no, I'm so glad you did it, because for me, I've been called the N-word here in Canada, more than once. I walked down John Street and I had someone call me a filthy nigger, and I'd be like, wow, and I'd be like, okay. And and it's like, and I love that you didn't censor that, because that's the experience, that's still happening. And like, you can't, and to censor and to sanitize it for the people so that other people don't feel uncomfortable. I'm like, it's not about you. This is about our experience. This is the reality of our lives. So talk to me about making sure that you honor them in that way, because I think it's very important, because the only time we see those kind of like those slurs and stuff acknowledged and uses in like period films, like the films like the Selmas, and the films about MLK and that kind of stuff. But when you have like documentaries, most people say like they were censoring and say anything. I'm like, no, you can't censor it, because this is how you need to hear the impact, because those words have impacts on us. They have physical impact. People call them microaggressions. I'm like, there's nothing micro about what happens.
Yes. So I think, it was very important to Michelle Stevenson and myself to make sure that we were not censoring the elders who were talking about their experiences. I mean, Brenda Dash, Robert Hill, Rodney John, and Adeline Marjolaire, Chancy, Norman Cook, they were all there. These were their experiences as Black people living in Canada in the 1960s, going to school in Montreal. This is, this episode really explores what it was like for them to be here in this era, being in Canada and be in Montreal at that time. And a lot of these people had never had an opportunity to really talk about their experiences. And so it felt wrong to kind of erase their words. It's not like these are, white folks talking about Black people. These are our Black elders talking about their own personal experiences. And again, many of them haven't had an opportunity to speak on the record about this. So it was really, really important to make sure that all of their words, even though some of them might be painful, were allowed to be heard in the Revolution Remix episode.
Mm. we're going to talk about I've only been able to see episode 3 because those are the links that were available. But before we talk about episode 3, I want to ask you about a specific creative choice that was made for episode 2, and that's shooting in film while showing it in black and white. Why? Because I thought that was very unexpected, because when I went from episode 1, which is in color, which again the background for those conversations was interesting. It was like a painting showing the rivers and the lakes of Canada at that point in time. But then when it switched over to black and white, it was like, and it kind of lends a poignancy to the scenes, and kind of say let's not get distracted by the color, just focus on their expressions and everything.
Right. Yeah. And so I think one of the things that was important was to have varying voices as part of this series. And so each episode is directed by a different Black Canadian director, and they were, able to approach the storytelling and the presentation of the episodes in a way that made sense to them and made sense to the storytelling. The story of the histories of Black Canadians. We are not a monolith. There are so many stories that can be told. And so we kind of tried to mimic that in a very small way by having different Black directors kind of, convey the different experiences in a way that visually made sense to them. And so for Michelle on Revolution Remix, the idea to use black and white, use the black and white aesthetic came from the archival material. So as you notice in that episode, there's a ton of amazing black and white footage from the 1950s and 1960s, from newsreel footage to also we use a lot of NFB, old films from the NFB of that time. And so Michelle really wanted the material, the interviews to match with that beautiful archival footage. So, and I also want to give out a shout out to our editor on that episode, Eamon O'Connor, who worked alongside Michelle on that episode to bring those beautiful visuals to life. So yeah, that was really that episode. Visuals came from the amazing treasure trove of archive that they had. That they found.
No, and it works, and it was so again, seeing that footage again, like I was like, wait, yeah, this is Canadian history. This is Black Canadian history, because again, this is something I have to keep mentioning, but it just keeps reminding me as I was watching the documentary episodes, is that Canadian media has done such, I think, an impressive job of, in a sense, erasing this part of Canadian history. This part of Black
erasure.
Yeah, it's like it's erasure of the history. It's erasure of Black culture as well. And that in itself is a form of violence. That in itself is a form of racism and anti-Blackness, because it's saying we can't show this history, because this will kind of, as we using the words, dispel the myth of what we are, of who we are. Like, people know about how the First Nations people are treated still up to this day, how the Indigenous people are still asking for what belongs to them. They're still largely and vastly disenfranchised on their own land. They're still being discriminated against, and they're still fighting for reclamation of their own history, showing like this is how we've been treated. And it's this, I think it's the same that's going to have to happen for Black people, and hoping for like a docuseries like this, especially being shown on CBC, is to say, it's time for Black Canadians to reclaim our history, for the people who are Canadian by blood, 6th and 7th Canadian, 6th and 7th generation Canadians, to say, this is our history. This is a part of it, and a part of that is talking about music, hip hop music. And I love this episode, Northern Beats, because again, so much things I didn't know about Black Canadian history, or just Canadian history in general, were revealed in this episode. And there's things that I wondered about, like the presence of hip hop his music. Like I know about the Caribbean music, you know, I know about that part of it, but the hip hop, it was like this. I'm like, you know what, this makes sense because like why wouldn't there be a big movement of hip hop music within the Canadian culture and Canadian diaspora? So talk about that for you. Like what was the most exciting thing that you and your team discovered, and then also what was possibly the most shocking thing that you discovered about this aspect of Black Canadian history? Like because hip hop came out of revolution, you know, hip hop came out of Black people trying to find a way to speak up. People think it's just about gangs and stuff. Like no, hip hop is rooted in revolution. Hip hop is rooted in Black people saying this is how we're going to get our message across. Same thing with graffiti. People think graffiti is just about vandalism. No, graffiti is about art. It's about it's an expression. Graffiti was about, started out as sending messages to each other and saying, this is a safe space. This is our block. You know, this is about claiming space. So that's a part of like Black history. It's in the hip hop community that a lot of people don't understand or don't want to understand. Like, it's not about being bad or hood or whatever. It's about revolution. That's where it came from. And that's the same thing was for Black Canadians.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think, you know, Will Prosper, the director of this episode, it was really came up with a really great entry point into this episode, which again, like, as you said, people don't really know about this history. And I think with this episode, it's kind of like, not just Black histories in Canada and Black peoples in Canada. This systemic erasure kind of also leads into like actual lived everyday experience. It has effects on our lived everyday experience. And in the case of the hip hop industry here in Canada, we see that because of that lack of kind of acknowledgement of Black folks in Canada, there was never any real commercial support or commercial recognition for hip hop music here in Canada. That just didn't happen in Canada. And still to this day, you know, that infrastructure, and Mark Campbell, who's interviewed for this episode, really does a great job of articulating how the Canadian music industry had no interest in supporting Black Canadian hip hop music, and in the fact that they did not do that, people like Drake, The Weeknd, Justin Bieber there was no infrastructure created for this genre of music, so they had to go elsewhere outside of Canada. So because of like Canada's lack of you know, acknowledging acknowledging its Black people and its history, the systemic erasure of our histories also had this impact today, where we see that like one of the biggest selling musical artists in the world, that there's no infrastructure to support him here. So it was a really just a very interesting entry point for us to explore in the Northern Beats episode. And it was, so that for me was the most shocking thing. But it was just really fun to kind of go back in time and, you know, hear all of that music and see those old music videos. Again, Will was really very excited to kind of like make sure, even though we only had 44 minutes, to be able to kind of even have audio acknowledgement to a lot of the amazing rappers and hip hop artists that were active and present in the 80s and 90s and early aughts. So the episode is chock-a-block full of, you know, old hip hop videos. It's a really fun trip down memory lane, and hopefully it will turn people onto some old school Canadian hip hop music. So.
No, for sure. Like, I know it has to be like for you growing up here. Like, what did it like take you and say, "Oh, hit me back to my teenage days or my preteen days"?
Yeah, I think, well, it was more like, stuff like looking at, you know, Master T and Much Music and So yeah, that's where I watched got all my music from. Yeah, definitely wasn't from commercial radio, because there was no commercial radio at that time. And yeah, it was definitely a trip down memory lane for me as well, to kind of see some of those old music videos from the 90s and early aughts. Yeah, it was a very fun episode, but it also kind of again digs into something that's really that's unknown for maybe a lot of people outside of the music industry.
And I know we're gonna have to wrap it, but something I want to discuss with you, and like you talked about the lack of infrastructure for Black hip hop artists in Canada. I want to kind of like bring it back to your own experience as a producer, because at the beginning you mentioned that you produce a lot of projects within the US. And I think it's kind of interesting that Canada is kind of the same way. Like even though Canada is kind of like the production mecca for North America, in the fact that so many projects are actually filmed here and produced here, like especially in Toronto, in Montreal, and in Vancouver. We know that's where like a lot of the VFX and production studios are. There's still not that big of an infrastructure opportunities for Black creatives. I remember I did a research piece for the Canada Media Fund, and it was talking about diversity and representation of Black people in Canadian media, especially on screen. And like the researcher was showing, like there's such a small number of Black creatives in the film industry here, because they're not given as many opportunities. It's still about the racial discrimination, still about gender discrimination within the film industry here. And so a lot of them, people like yourself, have to go to the US to find work. So talk to me about how the Canadian film industry itself is still not built for supporting Black creatives, because there's more projects now. There's like the Revenge of the Black Best Friend by Amanda Paris. That was a fantastic comedy series. There's a new one called Lord, forgive me, it's something, my brain, it's a Bria Max series, but that one also screened at TIFF as well. We have these new projects coming up. And then there were shows like The Porter, which again ties into your into the first episode, because like the porters that was one of the very few jobs that Black men could get in the turn of the 19th century in Canada, so like there's that connection too. But again, there aren't that many shows about Black Canadian people produced by Black Canadians, and a lot of that has to do with there's still so many obstacles within the film industry here in Canada.
Yeah, I think it's a very, and not to be disparaging at all, it's just I think the reality in Canada, it's a much smaller population there. Most of the funding comes from a few funding bodies, and so in order to get your projects made, you have had to have produced a project before that has been funded. So I think that becomes a kind of a hurdle for people who don't have who don't have like money to do that, or have a production company that's made things before. It's kind of like a chicken and egg it's the chicken and the egg. But I think there have been a lot of moves in the last few years to kind of address that inequity. And I have to give praises and props to CBC for, partnering with my production company and with my production partner, Miranda DePoncier on this project, and really taking a leap and supporting me in the creation of this project. They've been our partners again since 2019 on this, but I think there definitely is room to grow in Canada, as there is in the United States. Let's not get it twisted. It's not any easier over there. But I think, this is hopefully, shows like this one and the shows like you mentioned, and BLK and Oya Media's previous projects. There have been people who have been, despite all of those hurdles, making creating film and TV around the Black experience for years. Sylvia Hamilton, who we talk about in our episode Creation Assist, Clement Virgo, Claire Preto. So there have been people who've been doing this work for a long time creatively. And I think that work just needs to continue. And hopefully the show being on our, CBC will inspire other people to kind of continue to want to make more projects and more films, more documentaries, more web series, more comedy series about the Black experience, because there's still so many stories that need to be told, that can be told. This is only 8 hours which is not even a drop in the bucket. It's like a drop in the ocean. So there's a lot of room and a lot of opportunity, and hopefully this inspires again people to go out and want to tell their own stories. And hopefully this gives other broadcasters kind of realizing that there is an audience there and a market there for these stories to be told.
And do you see yourself doing another project similar to this after this? Because I know it's 8 episodes, so they haven't premiered as yet. But it kind of seems kind of premature to be asking this question. But for you, like, what do you see? Do you see yourself continue making more projects like this, especially because, as you said, this is just a drop, and there's so much more. Like the history of Black people in Canada is vast, when I was watching episode 2, I was like, I wonder if she's gonna do a story about the because it does talk about the West Indian community in Montreal, and it was like, I wonder if she's gonna do like Toronto, and it was just like, I would love to see the history of like Black immigrants in Toronto, because I know especially for like a lot of Bajans and Trinidadians and Jamaicans move to Canada in like the 70s, because it's Pierre Trudeau, but like Justin Trudeau's dad, he made it kind of easier for a lot of Black people to move here to pursue works as nurses and teachers and stuff. And I was like, I was so excited with the prospect of seeing like that part of like Black Canadian history, something that would be connected to me personally as an immigrant, because I like our culture influences Toronto culture so much, and I was like, yeah, I hope she does it. I'm excited to see what the other episodes will be. So do you see yourself doing something else like that?
Well, I think for me, the work I do is always around trying to unearth untold stories by Black folks and people of color in general. So I hope all my work will in some way continue, or I know my work will continue in some way to touch on the Black experience in Canada, regardless of whether there's like another season for the show or not. Like, for example, my next project I'm working on is looking at the insect apocalypse around the globe, but we're following a Black female Canadian entomologist. So, and her history of being Black and Canadian and that history and how that had informed her becoming a bug scientist is very prominent and interwoven into that story. So that will always be part of my work. So yes.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I'm looking forward to that one. I'm not necessarily a fan of bugs, but I actually love watching like nature and like science documentaries and that kind of stuff. So that would be very interested in seeing that one as well. But thank you so much for everything, first of all, for making this series and for working with your team doing this series, because it's teaching me so much about like Canadian history and Black Canadian history. And that's the thing, like there's so much to learn that, there's no chance to stop learning, but we just have to take the initiative to do it. And so thank you so much for this. I'm going to do my best to help promote it when it releases on CBC.
Thank you.
And so like, thank you so much for doing this, because I was like, look at this, I'm learning.
Yeah.
and I'm going to tell my sister, because my sister, she actually studied politics and world history and stuff in university. And she did study like the history of hip hop. like her thesis was based around the history of hip hop and and graffiti and that kind of stuff. So I was talking to her about it. She's excited about seeing the rest of the episode and everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll be dropping on Gem. The first 4 episodes will be dropping on Gem on October 18th, and then on October 25th, we'll drop on CBC TV.
Yay! Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and enjoy. You're on vacation, right? Is it vacation?
It's a vacation creative reset. So yes,
much deserved vacation. Vacation and creative reset, much deserved. You'll enjoy it there.
Thank you.